You're not reading this by chance. Something in your life has just changed, even if you haven't fully realized it yet. All the pain, exhaustion, and questions you've been carrying have finally reached their end. This isn't just a new phase. It's the end of a suffering you once thought would never end. Before we continue, take a moment to breathe. If these words feel like they're speaking directly to you, hit subscribe, like, comment, and share. There might be another soul out there who needs to hear this today. There comes a point in your life when the pain you've been carrying no longer shows up to break you. It arrives to close a chapter that has overstayed its place in your story. At first, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like pressure, like confusion, like everything is falling apart at once. You question why things keep slipping through your hands, why situations unravel just when you thought you had found some stability, and why the weight on your chest refuses to lift no matter how hard you try to push forward. But beneath that surface-level chaos, something far more intentional is unfolding. You are not being punished, and you are not being abandoned. What you are experiencing is a deep and necessary realignment, one that is quietly, almost invisibly, guiding you away from a version of yourself that can no longer carry you into the life you are meant to step into. For a long time, you may have tried to hold everything together. You tried to make sense of things that no longer made sense, to fix what was already breaking, to stay in spaces and identities that felt familiar even when they no longer felt right. And in doing so, you exhausted parts of yourself that were never meant to keep fighting that hard for belonging, clarity, or peace. What you didn't realize is that the discomfort you felt was not a sign that you were failing. It was a signal that you were outgrowing something. Growth rarely announces itself with comfort. More often, it shows up as disruption, as endings you didn't plan, and as an inner restlessness that refuses to be ignored. That restlessness is not your enemy. It is your internal compass, redirecting you towards something more aligned, more truthful, and ultimately more freeing. There is a quiet intelligence within your life that sees beyond your current perspective. Even when things appear to be falling apart, this deeper current is always moving you toward coherence. It dismantles what is no longer sustainable, even if you are not ready to let it go. It removes illusions you once depended on, not to hurt you, but to show you what is real. And yes, that process can feel harsh. It can feel like loss, like rejection, like being stripped of everything that once gave you a sense of identity. But what is actually happening is refinement. You are being peeled away from layers that were never truly you, conditioned patterns that kept you small, and attachments that anchored you to versions of life that no longer match your evolution. What makes this phase so difficult is that it often arrives without clear explanation. There is no immediate reward, no visible outcome, no reassurance that what you are going through will lead somewhere better. You are asked to walk through uncertainty without guarantees, to release control without knowing what will replace it, and to trust a process you cannot fully see. And yet, this is where your transformation begins to take root. Because in the absence of certainty, you begin to build something far more powerful, an inner stability that does not depend on external conditions. You start to realize that even when everything around you shifts, there is a part of you that remains steady, observant, and quietly strong. Over time, something subtle begins to change. The same situations that once triggered you no longer hold the same intensity. The thoughts that used to spiral endlessly begin to lose their grip. You notice moments of clarity appearing in between the noise, small but undeniable. These are not random occurrences. They are evidence that the realignment is working, that the old patterns are loosening, and that your energy is no longer tied to the same cycles of struggle. You are not where you used to be, even if you haven't fully arrived at where you're going. And that in itself is a powerful shift. So if you feel like everything has been breaking down lately, consider the possibility that it is not destruction, it is completion. The version of you that carried so much for so long has reached its limit, not because you are weak, but because you are no longer meant to live from that place. Something deeper is calling you forward, asking you to release, to trust, and to step into a new phase that does not require the same kind of suffering to sustain itself. This is not the end of your story. It is the end of a cycle that was never meant to last forever, and the beginning of something far more aligned with who you are becoming. For so long, you carried the weight of trying to hold everything together, even when every part of you was quietly telling you that something wasn't right anymore. You convinced yourself that if you just tried a little harder, stayed a little longer, or gave a little more of yourself, things would eventually fall into place. You kept showing up for situations that drained you, holding on to connections that no longer felt mutual, and forcing clarity out of circumstances that only grew more confusing with time. It became a pattern, one where you overextended your energy in hopes of preserving a sense of stability that was already slipping away. And in that process, you began to lose touch with your own inner signals, the subtle but persistent voice within you that was asking for change. There was a kind of silent exhaustion that built up over time, one that wasn't always visible on the outside but was deeply felt within. It showed up in moments where you felt disconnected, even in spaces that were once familiar. It appeared in the way your motivation started fading, in the way things that once made sense no longer resonated, and in the quiet realization that you were carrying more than you were meant to. Still, you kept going because letting go felt uncertain, and uncertainty felt far more uncomfortable than staying in something you already understood. You told yourself that maybe this was just a phase, that maybe things would return to how they used to be. But deep down, you knew that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back to who you were before. What you didn't fully see at the time is that this discomfort was not a sign of failure. It was evidence of growth pushing against its limits. You were outgrowing roles, expectations, and environments that once fit you perfectly but could no longer contain who you were becoming. Growth does not always feel like expansion. Often, it feels like tension, like being pulled in a direction you cannot yet define. It challenges your sense of identity, forcing you to question what you truly want, what you truly need, and what you are no longer willing to tolerate. And that questioning can feel unsettling, because it requires you to confront truths you may have avoided for a long time. There is a natural tendency to interpret this phase as something going wrong, as if the struggle itself is proof that you are off track. But in reality, the opposite is true. The very fact that you can no longer settle for what once felt acceptable means that your awareness has expanded. You are no longer operating from the same level of consciousness, and as a result, the same patterns no longer bring you the same sense of comfort. What once felt normal now feels restrictive, and what once felt safe now feels limiting. This is not regression. It is evolution, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. The restlessness you've been feeling is not random, and it is not something to suppress. It is a signal, a form of internal guidance that is trying to move you toward alignment. It shows up as dissatisfaction, as a lack of fulfillment, as an inner pull toward something different even when you cannot fully articulate what that different looks like. And while it may be tempting to ignore it, to distract yourself from it, or to push it aside in favor of maintaining what is familiar, doing so only prolongs the discomfort. Because the truth is, once you become aware that something no longer aligns with you, you cannot unknow it. That awareness stays with you, quietly shaping your decisions and nudging you toward change, whether you consciously act on it or not. At some point, you begin to realize that the effort you've been putting into holding everything together is no longer sustainable. Not because you lack strength, but because your energy is meant to be used differently now. You are not meant to keep forcing what naturally wants to fall away. You are not meant to keep proving your worth through constant struggle or sacrifice. Instead, you are being invited into a different way of living, one that is less about control and more about alignment, less about forcing outcomes and more about allowing the right things to come into place. And while that shift can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable at first, it is also where a deeper sense of ease begins to emerge. Because when you stop trying to hold on to what is no longer meant for you, you create space for something that actually is. Beneath everything you have been experiencing, there is a quiet intelligence moving through your life, one that does not operate on urgency, fear, or confusion, but on a deeper sense of order that you may not always be able to see. It does not rush to explain itself, and it rarely announces its presence in obvious ways. Instead, it works subtly, almost invisibly, guiding events, shifting circumstances, and influencing outcomes in ways that only make sense when you look back in reflection. Even in moments that feel chaotic or disjointed, there is a coherence unfolding behind the scenes. What appears to be random disruption is often a precise reconfiguration, a necessary dismantling of structures that can no longer support the direction your life is moving toward. This intelligence does not prioritize your comfort in the short term. It prioritizes your alignment in the long term. And because of that, it will sometimes allow things to fall apart in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable, even unfair. Situations you once relied on begin to shift without warning. People you thought would always be there become distant or leave entirely. Opportunities you were certain would work out suddenly collapse or change direction. From a surface perspective, it can feel like loss, like instability, like the ground beneath you is no longer steady. But at a deeper level, something more intentional is taking place. What is being removed is not meant to punish you, but to free you from attachments that are no longer in harmony with who you are becoming. One of the most challenging aspects of this process is that it often targets the very things you once used to define yourself. Your roles, your expectations, your sense of identity. These begin to shift or dissolve in ways that leave you questioning who you are without them. You may find yourself in unfamiliar emotional territory, no longer able to rely on the same patterns, reactions, or beliefs that once gave you a sense of control. This can feel disorienting, as if you are being stripped down to something raw and undefined. But this stripping away is not destruction. It is refinement. It is the removal of layers that were shaped by external conditioning, past experiences, and survival mechanisms that you no longer need in the same way. There is also a kind of exposure that happens during this phase. Illusions that once felt comforting begin to lose their hold, and truths that were previously hidden or ignored start to surface. You begin to see situations more clearly, without the filters that once softened their reality. This clarity can be difficult to face, because it requires you to acknowledge what is no longer working, what is no longer genuine, and what you may have outgrown long before you were ready to admit it. But this clarity is also a form of liberation. It allows you to make choices based on truth rather than habit, awareness rather than avoidance. What makes this intelligence so powerful is that it does not rely on force, it relies on inevitability. It does not need to convince you to change. It creates conditions where change becomes the only natural outcome. It closes doors that you might have kept open out of fear or familiarity. It introduces shifts that redirect your path, even if you initially resist them. And over time, you begin to notice that what once felt like resistance gradually transforms into acceptance, and eventually into understanding. You start to see that what you thought was being taken from you was actually making space for something more aligned, something that could not have entered your life while the old structures were still in place. So even when it feels like everything is being dismantled, there is something deeply supportive within that process. You are not being left without direction. You are being guided in a way that asks you to trust beyond what is immediately visible. This quiet intelligence is not separate from you. It is working through you, responding to your growth, your awareness, and your readiness to evolve. And while the process may not always be comfortable, it is purposeful. Every shift, every ending, every moment of uncertainty is contributing to a larger realignment. One that is leading you toward a version of your life that is not built on illusion or force, but on truth, clarity, and a deeper sense of inner stability. What makes this phase especially challenging is the absence of clear answers while you are moving through it. There is no detailed map, no visible endpoint, and no immediate reassurance that everything you are experiencing will resolve into something better. You are asked to continue forward without the kind of certainty you once relied on, to make decisions without having all the information, and to release attachments without knowing what will replace them. This lack of clarity can feel unsettling because the mind naturally seeks structure, prediction, and control. When those elements are removed, it can create a sense of vulnerability, as if you are stepping into something unknown without any guarantees of stability or success. In the past, you may have depended heavily on external validation to guide your choices. You looked for signs in other people's reactions, in predictable outcomes, or in familiar patterns that reassured you that you were on the right path. But in this phase, those reference points begin to fade. The usual feedback you once trusted may no longer be available or reliable. Situations that used to give you clear direction now feel ambiguous, and advice from others may not resonate in the same way it once did. This can leave you feeling temporarily disoriented, as if the compass you used to navigate your life has stopped working. Yet, this disorientation is not a sign that you are lost. It is a sign that you are being redirected inward. As external certainty decreases, something else begins to develop within you, even if you do not immediately recognize it. You start to build a deeper connection with your own internal guidance, a quieter but far more consistent source of clarity that does not depend on changing circumstances. At first, this inner voice may feel subtle, almost easy to overlook. It does not demand attention or create urgency. Instead, it offers a calm sense of knowing that gently points you in a direction without forcing you to follow it. Learning to trust this voice requires patience, because it often contradicts the habits of overthinking, second-guessing, and seeking constant reassurance from outside sources. During this time, you are also being invited to loosen your grip on control. This does not mean becoming passive or disengaged from your life, but rather shifting the way you relate to outcomes. Instead of trying to force every situation into a specific result, you begin to allow space for things to unfold in ways you may not have anticipated. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to equating control with safety. Letting go can feel like risk, like stepping away from something that once gave you a sense of security. But over time, you start to see that excessive control often creates more tension than stability, and that allowing does not mean losing direction. It means trusting a process that is working beyond your immediate awareness. There is a quiet strength that begins to emerge when you stop trying to resolve everything all at once. You realize that not every question needs an immediate answer, and not every uncertainty needs to be eliminated before you move forward. Instead, you learn to exist within the in-between spaces, where clarity has not fully formed but movement is still possible. In these spaces, you develop resilience, adaptability, and a deeper sense of presence. You become less reactive to temporary discomfort and more grounded in your ability to navigate whatever arises. This is where true transformation takes root, not in moments of complete certainty, but in your willingness to keep moving even when certainty is absent. Over time, what once felt like a lack of direction begins to reveal itself as a different kind of guidance. You start to notice that even without a clear plan, you are still being led toward experiences, insights, and opportunities that contribute to your growth. Connections form in unexpected ways, ideas emerge at the right moments, and situations align without the same level of force you once believed was necessary. This does not happen because everything suddenly becomes predictable, but because you are no longer resisting the natural flow of change. You begin to understand that clarity is not always something you receive before taking action. It is often something that unfolds as a result of trusting the process and continuing to move forward despite the unknown. Over time, the shifts that once felt almost imperceptible begin to gather momentum, forming a pattern that you can no longer ignore. What started as brief moments of relief, small pauses between waves of confusion or heaviness, gradually expands into longer stretches of clarity and calm. You may notice that your thoughts are no longer as chaotic as they once were, that the constant inner dialogue has softened, and that you are no longer pulled so easily into cycles of overanalysis or emotional overwhelm. Situations that would have previously consumed your energy now pass through you with less resistance, as if they no longer have the same access to your inner state. This does not mean that challenges disappear entirely, but rather that your relationship to them begins to change in a fundamental way. There is a growing sense of distance between who you are now and the version of you who once reacted automatically to everything. Where there was once urgency, there is now pause. Where there was once confusion, there is now observation. You begin to respond rather than react, to choose your energy rather than surrender it impulsively. This shift may feel subtle at first, but it is deeply significant. It signals that the patterns which once defined your experience are loosening their hold, and that you are no longer operating from the same conditioned responses that kept you in cycles of struggle. You are, in a very real sense, becoming more conscious of how you move through your life. Along with this internal shift comes a noticeable change in how external situations affect you. Circumstances that once felt heavy or draining no longer carry the same emotional weight. You may find yourself less affected by other people's opinions, less entangled in conflicts that do not truly involve you, and less inclined to chase outcomes that once seemed essential to your sense of worth. There is a quiet detachment that develops, not out of indifference, but clarity. You begin to recognize what truly matters and what does not, what deserves your energy and what does not align with your direction. This discernment becomes one of your greatest strengths, allowing you to move through life with greater intention and less unnecessary strain. At the same time, your intuition begins to sharpen in ways that feel both natural and surprising. You start to sense things before they fully unfold, to recognize subtle shifts in energy, and to trust your initial impressions without needing as much external confirmation. Decisions that once felt complicated become simpler, not because the choices themselves are easier, but because you are more attuned to what resonates with you on a deeper level. This growing alignment between your inner awareness and your external actions creates a sense of flow that was previously difficult to access. You are no longer forcing yourself into situations that require constant effort to maintain. Instead, you are moving toward what feels naturally supportive and sustainable. What is important to understand is that these changes are not accidental. They are the result of everything you have moved through: the discomfort, the uncertainty, the periods of letting go and recalibrating. Each moment of struggle contributed to this shift, even when it did not seem that way at the time. The clarity you are experiencing now was shaped in those moments when you felt lost. The strength you carry now was built when you thought you were at your weakest. Nothing was wasted, even if it felt that way while you were in it. Every experience served a purpose in loosening the old patterns and making space for a different way of being. As this new state continues to stabilize, you begin to recognize that you are no longer searching for the same things you once were. The need for constant validation, the urgency to prove yourself, the attachment to outcomes that once defined your sense of progress, all of these begin to fade. In their place, a quieter but more grounded sense of self emerges. You are not driven by the same fears, nor are you motivated by the same pressures. Instead, you are guided by a deeper understanding of who you are and what truly aligns with you. This is where a different kind of ease begins to take root. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from no longer being in conflict with yourself. Eventually, you arrive at a space that feels unfamiliar in the most quiet and profound way. Not because something dramatic has changed on the outside, but because something essential has settled within you. For the first time in a long time, there is a sense of calm that does not need to be chased, explained, or protected. It is simply there, steady and consistent, no longer dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly or outcomes unfolding the way you once expected. This calm is not the absence of challenges, nor is it a temporary escape from difficulty. It is something deeper, something rooted in the understanding that you are no longer defined by what you go through, but by how you remain within yourself as life continues to move. You begin to notice that the urgency that once drove your decisions has softened. The constant need to fix, control, or anticipate every possible outcome gradually dissolves, replaced by a quieter trust in your ability to handle whatever arises. This does not mean that you stop caring or that you become detached from your life. Instead, you engage with it differently. You are present without being consumed, involved without being overwhelmed. There is a balance that starts to take shape, one where you can experience emotions without being ruled by them, where you can face uncertainty without feeling destabilized, and where you can move forward without carrying the same weight of fear that once accompanied every step. In this space, you also begin to recognize how much of your past suffering was tied to resistance. The constant effort to hold on to what was slipping away, to make sense of what was not meant to be understood in the moment, and to force clarity out of situations that require time to unfold. That resistance, while understandable, created tension that amplified your experience of pain. Now, as that resistance fades, you start to experience life with a greater sense of openness. You allow things to come and go without gripping them as tightly, and in doing so, you discover that not everything needs to be controlled in order to be meaningful or secure. There is also a deep shift in how you relate to yourself. The self-criticism that once followed every perceived mistake begins to lose its intensity. The pressure to meet unrealistic expectations softens, replaced by a more compassionate and realistic understanding of your own process. You begin to see yourself not as someone who is constantly falling short, but as someone who has been learning, adapting, and evolving through every experience. This shift in self-perception changes everything, because it removes the internal conflict that once made every challenge feel heavier than it needed to be. You are no longer fighting against yourself while trying to move forward. You are finally on your own side. As this new way of being stabilizes, you start to experience a kind of freedom that is not dependent on external validation or perfect conditions. It is the freedom that comes from knowing that your sense of peace is something you carry within you, not something you have to search for outside of yourself. You no longer need every situation to go your way in order to feel okay. You no longer depend on others to confirm your worth or to provide a sense of direction. Instead, there is a quiet confidence that develops, one that is not loud or performative, but deeply rooted and consistent. It allows you to move through life with a sense of assurance that does not waver easily, even when circumstances are uncertain. And in this realization, you come to understand something that once felt impossible. Your suffering was never meant to be permanent. It had a purpose, a role in shaping your awareness, your strength, and your capacity to see beyond surface-level experiences. But it was never your final destination. What you are stepping into now is not just the absence of that suffering, but the presence of something far more meaningful, a life that is aligned with who you have become through everything you have endured. This is where a new chapter truly begins, one that is not built on survival or constant struggle, but on clarity, stability, and a deeper connection to yourself that cannot be easily shaken.